Well, thank you so much, Sandeep, for joining me today. Really excited to talk to you, and we had a stellar previous conversation. So I'm really happy to discuss in depth what we chatted about before, and so talk about your journey before, maybe your career path and journey before Elevar Equity.
Well, thank you, Grant, for this conversation. Yes, I think we had fun on that previous conversation. But yes, interesting place to start. So I grew up in different parts of India. My father worked for one of India's largest nationalized bank. It's owned by the government called State Bank of India. So it was a transferable job. My mother was in education, still is in education. And so basically, rural, urban India, the north, the south, a fairly mixed upbringing as a consequence. I eventually then did law. And after I finished my law, I practiced corporate commercial law for about 7 odd years. And then came to a point where I felt I needed to do something different. Perhaps I was a little bored with law, where the end purpose seemed to be a better document. I wanted to have some more purpose, some more meaning, and then decided to pivot completely out of law. And I guess maybe my legal education had some influence. At the time that I was in university, the place I went to, which is the National Law School in India, talked about producing social engineers as opposed to lawyers. Maybe that was part of the influence. But I think more importantly, just upbringing all over the country and the conversations at home, including a boarding school stint, all of that led to perhaps that kind of a choice. And so I left law and entered the microfinance space to start off, and then eventually into impact investing. So kind of that's a quick summary of my upbringing and early professional career.
Let's talk about Elevar and what sort of its mission and vision is, and it's sort of elevating, I guess, maybe a little bit what you learned in microfinance. Maybe take us through maybe what you learned from those years doing microfinance, and maybe how now you look at maybe VC as sort of this next level stage of what microfinance can be for Latin America, India.
We started investing on a simple premise that there are ideas, products, services where a for-profit approach would make sense. And what a for-profit approach could help on is fundamentally build scale, reach a larger footprint of people who had the needs and wants for essential products and services. And so you could build a fairly robust business, but also deliver something that was very important to low-income communities. So I think that was the broad canvas. And we, in our early days, certainly wanted to demonstrate that a commercial model was possible to be able to achieve that. Microfinance is where we started. That was our early investing trajectory. But over time, through the combination of what we learned in the microfinance sector, maybe a couple of things through some difficult investments that we made outside of microfinance, I think what subsequently became and what we call the Elevar method of investing, which we apply both in an Indian context and a Latin American context to your question, really emerged. So if you've got a few minutes, let me just try use two constructs that I often talk about. So one is a construct of how we invest, and the other is a construct of how we work with entrepreneurs to build really large scaled up companies. So I'll take them in order.
Sure.
So the first one is how we invest. So we spend an incredible amount of time on the ground, understanding the needs and aspirations, wants of low income communities. I mean, I like to call it immersion in some respects, but there's a lot of time that it's spent having those conversations. It's not market research. It's our own experience on the ground, talking to families, households, individuals within lower income communities, both in India and in Latin America. Once we understand those needs and aspirations, and we're really looking at where the expenditure is, where is the income coming from, so the wallet of the household, if you will, we're then looking at what are the essential products and services that low income communities are prioritizing for themselves. And there's no rocket science on that. It's financial services, they want education. So the needs are standard, but how to deliver those needs, what are those aspirations? And then the question of whether a business model can deliver the right quality at an affordable price is the fundamental question that we're trying to answer from an investing standpoint. And if we check that box and say, yes, it's possible, then the question is, who's the entrepreneur who has perhaps domain expertise, has real execution experience, perhaps in a large organization, was a C-level individual in a large organization, come to a stage in their career where they want to apply their experience, their background to build an organization which is their own legacy, create some more impact in the world. So finding that right entrepreneur. And then because that product or service, which is essential, so we know there's customer demand within low income communities, it is affordable, it's at the right quality, and we're adding on an entrepreneur who can build real scale, then, like I often like to say, scale is our commercial imperative, it is our impact imperative. It gives us both. We reach potentially millions of households as a fund. And in addition, we can build up to the right levels of profitability so that we can have a successful enterprise on our hands from an investment standpoint. So that's a broad construct, but some subtext of that is, how do you consistently add value to the end customer is a very big part of what we do. And it then leads into post-investment where the real work starts is, how do you think about growing organizations? And that's the second framework, what I sometimes call our portfolio management framework. We tend to go in early. And the reason we go in early is that we can then work with entrepreneurs to build the DNA, which is focused on low-income communities. You don't have to think about pivots of business models, so to speak, from middle income to low or from high income to low. You can just make sure that the company is built with that requisite affordability premise right from day one. So we go in early. We typically will deploy somewhere between $2 to $5 million at that stage. The goal is to demonstrate that that product and service can be delivered, and the unit that is delivering that product or service to the end customer can break even within a 12 to 18 month time period. We need that within 12 to 18 months because we're operating out of a fund cycle. So we need to see the scale within the life cycle of the fund. If we get that right, we then go into the second phase. You're typically raising a Series B at that point of time. We are investing, we may be bringing in a new investor, and you're building out the organization for scale. So senior management, risk management, governance, any technology enhancements that are necessary, all of those dimensions are brought in. Ideally, $5 to $10 million Series B, you're taking about 12 to 18 months again. And then, so effectively somewhere between 24 to maybe 30 months approximately, you have what is quite interesting, a robust business model because you've proven out your distribution unit economics in the first phase, and you now have an organization to scale. And so you can just go after the market opportunity as a consequence and create a lot more impact and a robust enterprise, which is truly scaled up and adding the value that we would like to see for low-income communities. So these are the two frameworks we actively use.
There's a bunch to unpack there. One would be some topics around scale. And then the other would be, I think the first I'd want to tap on, and maybe the two's kind of parallel together. The focus on India and Latin America, is that because the potential of scale is very similar because of population size and sort of the lack of technology being embedded at like foundational levels in those regions around the world?
Interesting question. Let me take the second part and we can come to the broader scale question. But I think sometimes good strategic choices are driven by internal considerations as well as market considerations. So the internal considerations, partnership of Elevar comes from these two regions. So as a
gotcha.
That's the internal dynamic. We grew up in these markets. We understand these markets. Of course, we have different funds which play to different strategies, but we fundamentally, those are our two markets. But you're absolutely right about the external dynamic. Because we are premised on this affordability and significant scale argument, we do necessarily have to operate within markets which have the requisite density of population, if you will, and that kind of a market condition in terms of the need and opportunity as well. So those factors have to come together. And that's perhaps the reason we focused on these two markets. Over time, I think we've just built deeper and deeper expertise in these two markets. They've evolved in very interesting ways, in many ways very similar, in many ways very different. If you really think about that trajectory and operating in a truly global diverse team of approximately 25 people, which sit in Mexico, the US, and in India, it's actually quite a fascinating melting pot of perspectives that exist internally at Elevar, looking at the question of how to build scale from an impact standpoint and from a commercial standpoint across these two regions, which are very different, but yet very similar in terms of the customer need on the ground and the potential business models that can deliver that customer need. So that's really the framework for India and Latin America. But you had a question on scale also, so happy to reflect on that.
Yeah, I think because we mentioned it a little bit in sort of our back and forth thus far. And it's such a, I think it's such a term, it's such a used term in many conversations that you have in your industry and I have with founders is that word, breaking that down a little bit of sort of what that means in different areas, I think is important because everybody talks about scale, but it's how would you define it and how do you look at like what makes scale a success for you, right? You're in that, if you say you're in Latin America and you have a product around fintech, right? And there's 12 to 18 months. How do you analyze scale, right? And then how you determine if something is working, or not? Is it a month to month growth metric of just like users? And obviously, if it's a B2C product versus B2B, those will be different metrics. But I guess maybe take perhaps even an example from a portfolio company. I guess how do you look at scale and successful and maybe when it's not successful, right? What does that look like and what are some of the determining aspects of how to define scale for you guys?
Wow, that packs a lot into that question. And you're absolutely right. It is such a used word, and it's not very clear always what people mean by scale. Let me try and approach this because I'm thinking as you ask the question. So let me try and approach this the other way around, and then I'll hopefully cover many of the subpoints that you asked about. Repeating the point that scale is our impact imperative. So we'll keep the commercial imperative aside. Let's focus on the impact imperative. In every fund, we typically look to make maybe 12 to 14 odd investments, and we would like to reach through the combination of those investments, whether in India or in Latin America, a combination of somewhere between 10 to 15 million households, if you will. Mm-hmm. That come from these low-income communities. So there is some analytical framework as a consequence when we do need a certain size as a fund. But individual investments will have different scale ambitions because the business models are by very definition different. And even if you take one sector, you can't assume that two business models within the same sector have the same kind of scale metrics. So I think that's a very important aspect, is that you need to be very clear in the context of an individual investment. I think one of the things that we spend an incredible amount of time pre-investment and through the investment, it's not so much about a month on month, you may track numbers, but we're big believers in what are the business metrics that speak to business, obviously, but also the business metrics that speak to customer value and the impact that we want to see in the ground. Because if I've long held this bias, and this may be foolish, this may be naive, but in my conversations with successful entrepreneurs, if you will, but even entrepreneurship in general, it is very difficult for entrepreneurs to kind of like optimize for multiple metrics. You say 20 metrics. There may be 20 metrics that are relevant to the business. There may be 100, if you will.
Yeah.
But to optimize the organization for scale, you can't really pick more than 3 to 5 metrics. You need to know what your primary focus is, because you wake up every morning. I mean, even as an entrepreneur at Elevar, there are key metrics that one looks at. And so you wake up every morning thinking about those metrics. So it's kind of 3 to 5 metrics. And I think how do things come together through a scaling journey? In an ideal world, you know your customer well enough, and you get to know your customer even better in that first 12 to 18 months phase. And you identify the business metrics at that point of time, and you're able to show a trajectory till a break-even point at an operating unit level. So that distribution economics gets established. Then you, of course, got the organizational framework. But through this journey, you've really identified your 3 to 5 metrics that are really going to demonstrate that you are indeed adding value to the customer, as well as you've got the commercial journey going at a very, very fundamental level, because you need to succeed for the organization in every stakeholder standpoint, including the end customer. And then you just scale those metrics at a very, very fundamental level. Some metrics may change over time. You may over time emphasize profitability more than you've emphasized it earlier at a corporate level. You may say that I've learned so much more about the customer, so my customer metric has gone through an evolution. So I think it's about the business metrics that speak to this point. But there's another dimension which is very important, Grant, is organizational design. And we've learned that in, maybe I would say in hard ways over time, is that the business metrics need to correlate also to a simplicity of organizational design. And there needs to be clarity on how organizations roll up so that you know that every layer within the organization is optimized to a commonality of thinking, but more importantly is also organized in a way where you're consistently adding value to the customer. It can't be only the CEO thinking about a certain set of metrics. Those metrics need to roll down, and what's happening on the ground needs to roll up. So the organizational design, what's the structure, who reports to who, where are the P&L, where is the P&L emphasis, all of those aspects need to be also thought about. And then ultimately, who are the people? And getting the people right is in some respects
Yeah.
so
I'd like to stay on it for a second. What I'm sort of been passionate about, and kind of I'll try to, it'll be a long question, of course. Seems to be my specialty, so I apologize for that. But I look at, we see sort of how technology has obviously touched the world, and it seems for the last sort of, let's say, 20 years ago. So the really investment has been, how can we make products for people with disposable income, right? There's a sort of easy business model. Let's use the best technology in the world to build products for that population. And I think what I'm most passionate about is, like, how do we use the greatest technology we've ever built as humans to really uplift nearly half of the world, right, that live on $2 a day, right? Or I mean, there's billions of people that sort of technology has not sort of embraced quite yet. And I guess maybe because of the business model, they haven't sort of figured it out quite yet. But I want to talk about scaling impact. And I think that's been a very difficult thing to try to digest, is how do we scale up eradicating poverty, scale up eradicating the destruction of hunger, right? How do we scale up education to really high level education to the world, and so on and so on. There's so many issues in these communities that technology, I think, can scale. Impact is how I look at it. I guess my question would be, is, it's a tough one, but like, how do we do that? And how do we look at VC or private equity investments, whatever it may be, as a real opportunity to not only make money, which I think is the thing that we've been reluctant to do, right? We say, hey, this is a nonprofit problem or thing to solve, and making money off solving societal issues has be down upon, but making money off the destruction of our environment has kind of been like okay to do, which is really a weird thing, right? It's like we left it up to nonprofits to figure out the really hard systemic problems in society, and left VC to kind of put money in things that are like gaming or something like that, which is fine, right? But like, there's such a disconnect, right? So I just want to, like, how do you think about scaling impact, right? And scaling these issues that face society?
Yeah, that's a lot of ground to cover. Very complex, big questions that you've asked, and I could not agree more that these are some of the larger questions that the world is beginning to address and needs to address a lot more going forward. So let me try and pick up a few different threads. So one is your comment about nonprofits and for-profits. And I fundamentally believe that there is unnecessary disconnection between those two worlds. There are so many issues under the sun where there is no business model that can even remotely address that. So that is the role of nonprofits. That is the role of government. And that perhaps approaches a certain segments of population, certain income levels. So there's a combination of the product or service, and there is the combination of disposable income to be able to even buy a product or service.
Right.
I think we have to be cautious on that front. You mentioned hunger. If there's a business model that addresses it from a food standpoint, somebody needs to pay for the food. So you're automatically dealing with a segment of the population which may have tiny bits of income, but at least can pay. Then you can think about affordable food. But for a set of the population which cannot even have that much disposable income, then you do need an alternate structure. So I am uncomfortable when people talk about the separation of these two, or even when say, oh, nonprofits, they don't scale and they are capital constrained, and so therefore I want to go to impact investing. Impact investing operates in a different context, and the work that nonprofits do, even impact investing very often is standing on the shoulders of giants within the nonprofit space. So I think I would say we have to just recognize the role of nonprofits and the role of impact enterprises, if you will. But of course, all of this is in the continuum of what you're asking, which is a larger question, which is the relevance of investing strategies, the relevance of capital within a broader context of a better world and a better planet and all of those kinds of contexts. And the fact that so much capital is historically moved only in search of a return without any other dynamic. And so has it been extractive in nature, whether with people or with the planet, but are there other methods that we can think about? So let me posit something out here, which hopefully, at least can make some kind of a dent to the conversation. I genuinely believe that, if people, the mass of people who don't have access to essential products and services is one big challenge that exists in the earth. And if the other big challenge that exists in the earth is the environmental dimension and climate change and all the issues associated with that, we have to be inclusive before we can be green. And perhaps we've come to a point where maybe it's not even before we need to be but we certainly have to be inclusive. We just can't be green or vice versa, because there's not much point to say we're going to solve something on the green side, but we're going to continue to exclude a few billion people on the planet. So that's another false dichotomy. If the nonprofit, for-profit world is one way that we need to actually learn to work with each other, I think this dimension is also the other dimension. We have to be inclusive to even have a hope to address the green dimension. So I think that's a second point that I would make. The third is, I think, your question about what are the problems that have been solved and how is capital being used, and should capital move into much more fundamental problems? I would say yes. I mean, that's been 15 years of our journey of trying to attempt that. So as a consequence, when we started our journey, we all came from commercial backgrounds. If you look at everybody on the team, they're all people who come from commercial backgrounds, reach a certain stage in their career and saying, I want to use my skill set for something better. And therefore I become an Elevarian as a consequence, trying to invest towards that end. So what are we trying to achieve? We're essentially saying, we want to use capital to solve something fundamental on the ground. And we think that this notion that you have to look at impact completely separate within an enterprise and the business completely separate in the enterprise is also the third false dichotomy which exists in the world. There is a way to look at business metrics which answer both sides, and you can be thoughtful about how your capital is going to be deployed towards creating that better world, whether from a people or from a planet standpoint. Now, our strategy has specifically been around the idea of essential services. So we are focused as a consequence on things like education, agriculture, MSMEs, and financial inclusion in a broader sense. It's a very sharp, focused definition of impact. But irrespective, the method that we use of business metrics can work. So I'll break it down for you. On the impact side, there are three business metrics that we always look at. So one is, who is the customer segment? So we call it our community metric. Who? How do we know that the company continues to focus on the community that we believe they were set up for, they have the vision for, and they have the aspiration and the ambition for? And so what's the business metric that we can look at for the purposes of knowing that they continue to focus on that? So if it's an education company and we want them to work with an affordable school, what percentages of the schools that they're working with are affordable by very definition? So we have two companies in the education space. One is a lending company, the other is an operating company. The former is called Vartana, the second is called Lead, and both have clarity on what is the definitional construct of the kind of school that they want to work in, and that's our community metric. The second piece we're really calling we call it our business model metric, but it's really the customer stickiness. How do you know that you're adding value to the customer? What's the business metric that can show you that you're continuously adding value to the customer? And one example could be a referral rate. You delivered a product to the particular customer. The customer loves it. Without providing them with a financial incentive, are they willing to refer their neighbor to actually also get the product or service? So referral rate could be a very interesting metric to think about from a customer stickiness business model perspective. The third is straightforward. It's what everybody does within the nonprofit world as well as in the for-profit world, which has impact as its ambition, is the scale number. How many people have you reached? Now, when you put this three together and you kind of apply it into any kind of business model, I would argue that these three, along with maybe anything else that any individual organization wants to focus on, will align capital. Now, we've deployed something like $220 odd million of our equity into companies directly. The total co-invested capital that's come into the portfolio is north of $2 billion. And a significant majority of that capital is mainstream commercial money coming into these companies. But when they're coming in, there's obviously a conversation about who's the customer, what's the alignment, because they're typically following us. They're not necessarily, the bulk of that capital is not coming up along with us because we tend to go in very early. And so we're really focusing on the alignment question out there. And in general, if you're clear, an entrepreneur and the existing investors are clear with an incoming investor on what the business model is, who's the customer, what are the drivers of growth, and you're very clear about that and you can consistently deliver that, I actually think large pools of mainstream capital do align. So we've not necessarily seen what people in my space call mission drift as a consequence within the portfolio coming from investor dynamics. And even if they do come up, there is a broader board, there is a governance structure which understands what the DNA of the organization is. So I think there are ways to address this. They're not perfect, but there's certainly ways to address these challenges. And hopefully we've innovated a little bit to be able to lay that ground. We need to also continuously push ourselves as we look to scale our own journey. We've reached something like 45 million odd households plus minus over the last 15 years. I think the big question is, how do we reach a significantly larger number as we think about the next 10 to 15 years in our evolution, which will be a question for us to address.
Yeah, I want to talk about those, let's say last 10 to 15 years and some of the portfolio companies, if you don't mind,
Sure.
of sort of what they have done or what they have accomplished. Some real world example, maybe a couple from, India and a couple from Latin America.
Happy to share some thoughts on the portfolio and move relatively quickly because give you different examples, right? We have an agriculture company in India called Samunati, which works with agri enterprises and in addition, what are called farmer producer organizations. It's a unique corporate structure that India provides for a farmer-owned enterprise to provide value to farmers who are the shareholders of the company. And so they work with these kinds of organizations to reach small and marginal farmers to be able to bring agri-commerce as well as agri-finance to be able to scale up and improve incomes, livelihoods, and the margins of farmers as a consequence. The company has built very, very interesting scale. We just love that company. I mentioned Lead School. It's an education company focused on educational outcomes, measures itself by educational outcomes at an individual child level. But the way they do it is by bringing a combination of a technology solution as well as textbooks and curriculum and methodology and pedagogy, all of that into the classroom, into an affordable school classroom, where they're able to enable a teacher who has very limited resources to be able to drive impact as far as her children are concerned and really be able to support that teacher to be able to provide a great educational outcome. So they have a teacher app, they have a parent app, they have a school administrator app, and there is a complete interface in terms of what is the work being done in the classroom? What is the work that needs to be done at home? How does the school administrator view the entire school? And how are we achieving the educational outcomes? And there's a business model premised on that whole thing. They today are working with 5,000 odd schools and are scaling dramatically as a consequence. So those are two really solid examples. We have multiple. We've got MSME in the country. We work with a few MSME finance companies. There's a company called IndieFi. There's a company, we work with somebody who's doing two-wheeler finance in the country and is at the cusp of the electric revolution as that starts emerging to be able to finance that and create the ecosystem associated with that. So it's a company called Bike Bazaar. So this is kind of the India portfolio. On the LATAM side, we have a company called Nuvem Shop, which the best way to think about it is, in many respects, you can think about it as an e-commerce platform, but I like to say an e-commerce platform which is built and constructed to add value to the MSME that is making products or services to find market linkages and then build the payment infrastructure and build the necessary pipes for them to find markets as a consequence. So the emphasis of it is a little different. Think of it as perhaps the Shopify of Latin America in some respects. Again, a very successful company out there. We have a company called Credit Justo out there, which is MSME finance and leasing play in Mexico, again, doing extremely well. Mention a third company out there. There's a company called Favo, who works with individuals within communities to aggregate demand for basic groceries and then be able to supply them at the right quality and at the affordable prices by people who are inside communities. So if you look at all our business models around, everything is actually not a top-down model. In fact, all our business models are, and we're looking for entrepreneurs of that kind who are thinking about everything bottom up. So you start with the customer. What's the interaction point with the customer? How do you leverage technology out there? That piece. And then you go through the organization and kind of like build it upwards. So the DNA is consequently very, very different. And that's something I think we've really been able to show can work through the success of some very, very wonderful entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I think we touched on a little bit of how the relationship between nonprofits and allocators of capital or venture capital how maybe they can work together better to help scale certain things. I want to talk about maybe another partner that has its, I guess, pros and cons, can be difficult obviously, and that's sort of governments,
Yeah.
and whether it's sort of local and maybe at a higher level in certain regions. Have you had conversations with government? I just think that when you look at startups, in cities, especially, in America, or sort of I'm from, there sort of hasn't been this, to me, like this really in-depth sort of trying to partner together to do certain things. I mean, sometimes like, hey, come build your cars here, right? Like these sort of big projects that get on TV, you can cut tapes, whatever. But at a real sort of startup level, right? Early stage startups and investing, millions into a local company or something like that that has real chance to kind of help their citizens, right? Like how has been the relationship maybe, or just conversations with governments, whether it's India or Latin America? Have those been fruitful? Have those, I guess, what's your take on sort of private public sort of partnerships to help, scale a lot of these things we're talking about?
No, that's a very interesting question, and I'd broaden it from saying just governments, but also to regulators, right? I
Yeah,
think
yeah, yeah.
that's the construct. I may be a little counterintuitive on this, but in my view, it's I've just generally found, at least within the Indian context, that regulatory frameworks are helpful and can be very positive as far as driving change from a customer standpoint. So I that's one thing I do want to call out. Secondly, I do think that there needs to be recognition that government does play a role when you are dealing with the impact ecosystem, irrespective of where in the world you're operating. It could come through pools of capital, which could be, for example, on the debt side. It could come from regulation, which requires other financial services providers like banks to provide credit, maybe
Right.
to a microfinance institution or to another kind of lender that's focused in the market. So there is a lot of that which happens, and it's not something that I would say does not happen. In fact, it actively happens. Almost every one of our companies, for example, which is in the financial services space, has borrowed from institutions that are government regulated or actually government owned more fundamentally. So I would say that partnership does exist, and it's a very meaningful, and there is regulation which plays a very positive role as a consequence. I think very often the worry from government comes from what I would call the political, and I think the other dimension where the worry from government comes from, if your revenue model is premised on the government paying.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
think there is space for that. But I think in a broader VC community, I think, there's probably more caution when it comes to that. If I were to take the premise of your question and say, where do I see that sometimes operating? But in many of our companies, actually, you see very active, positive engagement. You see multilateral money coming into our companies as equity investors, which is ultimately governmental money of different kinds. And so you do see DFI multilateral capital also coming and as investors into some of our portfolio. So I think there are different shapes and forms of that kind of relationship. It is more complex, but I think there are models which work and certainly have been implemented across our.
And keeping on that sort of subject of like, cities and regions, are there any ones that maybe you want to give like some praise to, maybe sort of startup hubs within, countries in Latin America, or cities or regions or cities in India that have, really embraced, startups and sort of the entrepreneurship sort of journey and mission of trying to solve problems through business, right? Are there any sort of local areas that you think are sort of just, hotbeds right now for really embracing the entrepreneurship journey?
Well, I think maybe a few years ago, I would have been very specific and say, oh, we see many of our entrepreneurs coming from this region because of
Yeah.
X factor, because of Y factor. But I think we have to recognize that the nature of entrepreneurship, the source from where entrepreneurs are coming, is democratizing a lot.
Yeah.
It is definitely coming from all over the world. And if you look at even active pipeline within the India portfolio today that we're considering or are open to considering investments, etc. You're seeing entrepreneurs coming from all over the country. It's not necessarily coming from the 5 or the 6 top cities of the country. So that's amazing, because fundamentally, that means that talent is closer to the ground in terms of the problem statement that they're trying to solve. Now, the question will really become interesting is as you go into these smaller towns and if these organizations start to scale, is how do they attract that talent at scale to be able to build even further scale, which will become the interesting thing is does that talent exist in a small town? But I think in that respect, maybe because we're all getting used to work from home and hybrid work cultures, etc.,
Yeah.
maybe actually now that's going to lead to a proliferation of entrepreneurships and leadership that coming from different parts of the world. So I actually want to celebrate the reverse. I want to celebrate the fact that it's coming from all over. And even in very difficult environments, even from a regulatory standpoint in some parts of the world or in cities where you don't normally associate with entrepreneurship, etc., you're seeing the emergence of high quality entrepreneurs. And it's awesome. It's just awesome.
I'll kind of end on a last couple questions here. And one would be just, your process as an organization of, choosing who to invest in, whether it's is it an email pitch, right? Or doing networking events? Do you trust other VC partners that present you with opportunities? I guess, how are deal flow coming to you at the moment? And what's the process of sort of navigating the deal flow and actually then choosing, for lack of a better term, write a check, right? And really invest in companies. What's that process like for you?
No, very interesting question again. I mean, so deal flow comes in all the usual ways that any VC would get deal flow. It comes in cold, it comes in through a reference, it comes through an investment banker, it comes through a call. I mean, there are all the various ways that any VC gets. What I particularly love is that we get a reasonable amount of pipeline through our entrepreneurs and people that we really like and trust. And so we sometimes call our capital human-centered capital. If you ask me, there is a process layer which is very robust and very strong in the evaluation of an investment. But ultimately, if you ask me what really tips the scale is the alignment that we can build with an entrepreneur. And by alignment, I mean 2 or 3 different things. So one is we are interested in the problem that the entrepreneur is looking to solve. And we are aligned in the way he's or she is looking to solve that problem. So it could be that because of our own thesis development at our end and the time we've spent in the field talking to low-income communities and the end customer, we think a different approach will work. And the entrepreneur is talking to us about a different approach. And if we can't come to a consensus on that actually we share a common vision of how to approach that, we'll pass on that investment. So I think that's one aspect of alignment. But the other aspect of alignment is, can we work together for 5 to 7 years? And can we have that honest conversation? And how do we know that that can happen through the existing conversations through the investment cycle that we're trying to make? So I would say these 2 aspects of alignment are very, very important. In addition, of course, you're looking at the product construct, you're looking at the overall quality of the team, you're looking at any traction that they may have had at the point that we're considering it. But we go in early, we're very comfortable with raw startups. So maybe, that of course depends on the organization. We're spending time on their financial model and their projections. So we're looking at all those conventional things. But I will say one additional thing which we're different, Grant, I don't think any of us think of ourselves as an investment shop in the classical sense. We kind of average 3 deals a year, and that's through our LATAM capital as well as our India capital. On a combination basis, it's broadly about 3 deals a year on an average. And so even though we're an early stage investor, we're not just doing 8, 10 deals and then hoping for 2 to succeed. In fact, it's the opposite. In fact, most of our companies go from stage 1 to stage 2, when I talked about those 3 phases, quite consistently. And so set themselves up to having the opportunity for scale. Now, whether they achieve scale through the second phase, the platform to get into the third phase is a different. We actually think of that organizational platform second phase as being more difficult to build than the first phase of getting the distribution economics right. So I think our pipeline and our process is really about finding the 3 plus minus great deals globally where we really like the entrepreneur. We have that sense of alignment. We think the product construct makes incredible sense. And the distribution strategy that the entrepreneur is telling us is something that we can relate to and believe in based on our own experience in the field. So that is how our pipeline gets constructed. And as a consequence, it tends to be a little bit more proprietary, is the word people use in our space, where it's not very competitive when we come in, but then other folks tend to follow us through our journey.
One more question than the last question. And one would be, I think, like you said, that the distribution of where entrepreneurs come from now, and sort of, I think, this really a revitalization of what entrepreneurship is. I think everybody, wants to put their toe in the water, so to speak, and kind of try it out and maybe, figure something out for themselves. But I want to take it even a step further now and talk about maybe the new investing class, right? I think people are learning more and more about how to invest, what to invest in, but and more people wanting to get to startup investing, right? Whether it's an angel investor or maybe somebody's been in a certain industry for a long time and maybe they want to raise money, to start their own fund, right? I guess what are some simple, maybe practical advice for the new sort of angel investor, right, or the new sort of GP that's coming up and maybe wants to dip their toe in the water on this side of things and really allocate capital to entrepreneurs that they believe in. What are some of the advice you would give there?
I don't know whether I'm a good person to provide advice on. I don't see myself as an investor.
But you've learned a lot, right?
Yeah,
15
sure.
years in it. I mean,
Yeah,
there's definitely lessons there, right?
perhaps the one thing I would say, investing is a curious balance between things that you know and therefore you can get a sense of comfort, and then things you don't know and therefore you take risks. So it's that balance between those two. So I would say for folks like angel investors, etc., you see a lot of that capital and people either are going in with a little bit of herd mentality because somebody else has taken the call. But I would say people should build their portfolios based on what they know and then see what's the level of innovation and risk that they're willing to bear. I would say would be one piece. On the GP side, I think I would say is clarity on what you're looking to focus on. And I think the sharper the focus and the kind of change you want to see through your portfolio is probably a better thing, because you then develop deeper expertise and can then be more valuable to the entrepreneurs that you're looking at. I kind of like think of it as, there's that old adage of the cobbler who sits in the forest and everybody who has a slipper or a shoe problem goes in search of that cobbler. So I think GPs also need to build expertise. And I think that's very important.
Last question I have is about the future. And we talked, over a decade, 15 years now. What does the next decade look like from what are some of your goals and missions, for the next decade? And how do you look at, those? I know the future can be difficult to predict or I didn't even talk about, but are there some, goals you have in mind that you want to achieve?
So that's the fundamental question that I think we are trying to answer. Over the last decade plus, we've really, really worked hard to establish a method of investing that we call the Elevar method. And it's a very consistent, very deliberate, very disciplined method of investing that we've adopted, which we learned through some mistakes early on, and then you kind of apply it. The question that I think is very, very important is how to address the change we want to see in the world, but given the pace within which we need to see that change. A colleague of mine talks about achieving that change within a generation. And so speed of demonstrating business models that are adding value to the end customer and then thinking about reaching more people through those business models. We can't take enormous periods of time. We have to be able to do more of that quicker, capitalize them and build scale as a consequence to be able to reach millions of people so that they can improve their lives in very, very basic ways. So I think the biggest question for us in the immediate future will be to think about what that means for us as a fund manager, if you will. But even broader, if you take a 10, 15-year view, hopefully we really fundamentally solved some real issues on the ground, at least in terms of the essential products and services from our standpoint, that we would have well-established business models that work, have become ubiquitous. Everybody has access to them. For example, today in India, everybody has access to a microfinance product. I mean, it's not... It is fairly ubiquitous. It's commoditized in that sense. And how do you make sure that a quality education product is commoditized? How do you make sure that,
right,
in the context of an agri supply chain, the interventions you make from a product standpoint are ubiquitous in that supply chain? I think making that as common as possible and commoditized as a consequence should be the goal, because then we can go to the next order of problems. Because so long as, at least as Elevar is concerned, we still see the problem on the essential product and service side. We can't address more different set of problems. We'll continue to be focused up here. So we want to get that done much faster so that we can move on to a different set of problems.
Amazing, Sandeep. Thank you so much for taking the time. Keep on doing the work that you're doing. I mean, it's incredibly important. I think I think a lot of people just don't know like the importance of capital allocators and the decisions that they make, like you said, you affect 45 million households, right? So like your decisions are pretty important. And I think it's really important to talk about, these visions and missions, because what you do matters. And I think what people like you do around the world, it really, really matters and affects society kind of in ways we don't maybe perhaps know or see or understand at a certain level. So, keep up the great work, and best of luck for you and the team for the next decade to come.
No, thank you, Grant. I really enjoyed this conversation. If you bear with me, I will summarize that question on the future that you asked in one sentence.
Sure.
If you'll just bear with me, I think our mission is to establish the credibility of the end customer, that they do have the capability to demand quality, to pay for it so long as it's affordable, and to get the world of capital to understand that it is a credible customer base and you don't have to worry because the resilience levels are just phenomenal in that